In this week's tutorial on weathering your rolling stock, it's time to add some rust streaks to your model. So let's get started. Now we're going to add some rust streaks. We've got the car looking kind of grungy and dirty, but I think rust streaks really add to the realism. There might be a bad spot in the paint and it chips, and that causes a rust bubble, and then that streaks. So here's how I do that. First, choose a rust color. And again, I'm back to my oils using the Winsor Newton. I like burnt sienna for a lot of it. Get a fine brush. Then put a little bit of oil on the brush. Find a spot where you might expect it to rust, often near the edge of another piece of metal, often down from the roof line. Good thing to do too is work from prototype photos. I'll link a couple photo sites I like to go to with a huge library of photographs. You can even look for specific cars by number, if you know the real numbers of cars. And working from a realistic photograph at least helps me a lot, rather than just guessing. So I'm putting dabs of this oil paint on the roof line. Then I'm going to take a wide fan brush again, dab it in the thinner, and wipe most of it off, or some of it off, on a towel. I'll just put the tip into the thinner and it will absorb it right up into the bristles. So I'm going to take a lot of it off and then just swipe straight down and watch the rust streak. Do your best to keep it in a straight line. If you take off too much, that's okay. You can always do it again. But look how quickly that looks like real streaks. Then after you've made the streaks, you can add some more. Another method I use to try to keep the brush in a straight line, take a dowel, position it maybe against the car, or just hold it against your mat, and then use that as a guide. Rest the brush up against it, pull down on the brush as it rubs down the side of the dowel. You could also use an engineer's square or a square of some kind that you know will be perpendicular to the car, and then just run the brush down this edge of it. When you're done with the streaks, you might want to go back and just dab in a little bit more to the top, because often the streaking will take off a little too much at the source. But we'll do that more when we get to spots. So if you want to do rust spots, just put a dab in random spot, same thing. Dab the brush in some thinner, pull straight down, get a rust streak. Remember, you don't need much to make it look realistic. Now for rust spots, just take a little bit of your burnt sienna or whatever color you want and just touch it, little dab. Then the same thing with the fan brush. Moisten it, dry it off, and then pull down for some straight, even streaks. If you feel your streak looks too wide, just get the fine brush back out, a little bit of thinner, paint down each side of the streak and narrow it down with the thinner. You can sort of custom make and tailor each streak that way. Before we go any further, I like to take a matte coat and spray it all again, just to seal everything that's on there already. Make sure your hands don't smear it or take it off. And remember, the oil paint does take a while to dry, so be sure it's dry and then spray it with some matte coating for the next steps. For the next thing, we're going to add some chipping. What I like to do for that is take a sponge, and you can use either a regular cleaning sponge from Walmart or something, cut off a little piece of it. And that's a nice sized closed cell size for O scale. Small holes that will make random patterns, but we'll dab it in paint and then touch it to the car. But natural sponges also can be used with sometimes larger patterns for chipping. So let's see how that's done. We'll start with the old faithfuls of burnt sienna and burnt umber. Take your pick or use both. So I just open the tube, wad up the sponge so there's a small surface area, dab it into the paint, and take some of it off so it's not a whole lot on the sponge. Then very lightly just touch the parts of the car where you want some dabs of rust. Usually on the bottom edges, around places where they climb the car or handle the car, like footsteps, around the door handles. Doesn't need to be touched hard at all. It's better to have to redo it than to try to take it off. It's another reason for the matte coat. If you need to clean things up, it should protect everything you've done underneath it. I go back sometimes and dab some on the roof edges, which is a common place for rust. Again, refer to your photographs. Don't forget the ladders and details you've taken off the car. They might be sitting somewhere else. It's easy to forget. Here I'm going to use some burnt umber, and same method though. Just dab lightly here and there. Random patterns, and you'll instantly have some weathered accessories. Remember, it's not just on the front surfaces, but also on the sides and edges. Doesn't need to be a lot. Now we want to do the truck frames. Can't forget these little details. They will stand out if they're not as dirty and rusty as the rest of the car. So what are we going to do? They should have already been sprayed with matte spray. And now I'm going to take some roof brown. You can choose whatever dirty color you'd like, but I figured this matches the kind of work that this car is doing. I'm going to thin the paint just a little bit because I want it to be more like a wash than a paint. You don't want to paint them, you just want to leave some dirt in the crevices. Once it's sort of skim milk-like appearance, I'll brush it on all parts of the trucks, tops, bottoms, insides, around the springs. Looks like too much now, and it is, but we will be taking that off. Just want to be sure it gets in everywhere. Then I'll clean the brush and dry it off a little bit and soak up the paint. Don't forget the couplers also. Any part that's visible, get that nice and dirty. Once you clean it off, it'll look something like this. There you can see the difference between the unweathered trucks in the back and the ones I just weathered. I'm going to add one more thing to the car, and that is some powders. Usually along the bottom edge, again where any place it's often handled, where the dirt flies up from the trucks, the wheels. I think these powders will add to the worn look. I use either Bragdon brand powders. There are many you can get. Some people use chalks. They scrape themselves. I use these Brandon colors because they have an adhesive mixed in with them, which helps them stick a little better to the paint than chalks. Another brand is Monroe Models. And I'm going to use stenciling brushes. This is for craft stenciling. There are many different sizes you can get, and usually in a pack like this. Very stiff, and I use these only for powders. Never get them wet. That helps keep them just the way you need them for this process. And I take a piece of wax paper, big enough, a little larger than the car, fold it in half down the middle and make a kind of sharp crease. And that way, when I'm done with the powdering, which I'll do over top of the wax paper, then I can just fold it and dump it back in the unused part. So here we've got grimy gray or soot black. You can see the gray is just too close to the gray that's on there. We'll never see it. So I'm going to use the soot black. Set the gray aside. To take one of the stenciling brushes, I'm going to start with a small one. Just dab it into the powder, and then I tap it. You can see there's a little bit on there, but I'm going to still tap to get the brush to get most of that off. Don't want a whole lot on there. Again, it's easier to add more than it is to subtract. But if you end up with powders that you don't like and it's just too much, you can spray it with a matte spray like we did earlier, and it will almost entirely disappear, and you can do it again. So tap off the extra and just brush it again where there's wear. There you can see better what it's doing to the car. I use my finger sometimes to blend it out. Again, work on all the edges where you'd expect wear and dirt. Using a small brush helps prevent from overdoing it too quickly. If you know you want large areas covered, the whole side of the car, some people do most of the car in powders, you might start with a larger brush. It makes for a more uniform grime than these little small ones. You can just rub it around in the areas where there'd be a lot of work and dirt. If you get too much on it, just tap the car, dump it off. This adds the final weathering appearance. So the only thing left are the wheels. So I've taken them off, as we've seen from the previous videos. It's much easier to work with. And I'm going to use these powders from Monroe Models. The new Fresh Rust looks about right. So what I do is I take a regular Q-tip, dab it in a little bit of the powder, and just rub it around inside. You don't want to get it on the rim, or at least don't want it to stay on the rim. If you do, you just wipe it off with your finger a little bit. You don't want it super rusty probably, but that's up to you. All wheels show some kind of rust. Another tool, if you have it, are these little applicator tools you can get at the hobby store. A smaller tip than the Q-tip. You can get in smaller places. Maybe you're doing HO scale or something, and this will make it easier. Just smear it around, dump off any extra if you have it, and then clean off that rim if you need to. You also want to clean off the stem that sticks out on which the wheel pivots. You want it to roll smoothly. Here's the before and after. If you didn't do that, it would probably stand out against the otherwise weathered car. So that finishes our boxcar weathering. Hopefully you'll see a benefit to doing this on your layout. My next video will be about how to weather black rolling stock, just for the fun of it.